The art of letting go. There are moments in life when we feel lost, as if we're drifting in an endless ocean of sorrow. Have you ever experienced a loss so deep that it felt like a part of you was taken away? Maybe it was the passing of a loved one, the end of a long-time relationship, or the realization that life will never be the way it once was. No matter how much we try to hold on, everything eventually changes. For John, a retired teacher in his 70s, that moment came when his wife, Margaret, passed away. They had spent over 40 years together, sharing breakfasts, walks in the park, quiet evenings with an old record playing in the background. And then, suddenly, she was gone. The house that once felt warm and full of life now seemed empty. Every corner held a memory. Every morning, he still reached for her side of the bed, only to remember she wasn't there. "I can't move on," he admitted to an old friend one day. How do you let go of someone who was your whole world? His friend, a former colleague who had spent years studying Buddhist philosophy, simply smiled and said, "You don't have to forget, but you do have to let go." John didn't understand at first. How could he let go without losing what he cherished? Then, one evening, as he sat alone in his living room, he played an old vinyl record. The familiar melody of Let It Be by the Beatles filled the room. As he listened, the words struck him in a way they never had before. "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be." For the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. Could it be that the key to peace wasn't in holding on, but in learning to let things be? We all struggle with letting go. Whether it's grief, disappointment, or fear of change, our instinct is to resist. We replay moments in our minds, wishing things had turned out differently. We grasp at memories, relationships, or even our own identities, hoping to keep them frozen in time. But the more we cling, the more we suffer. So, how do we release the pain without feeling like we're losing what we love? How do we accept life's changes with grace? Today, we'll explore the Buddhist wisdom behind Let It Be, the practice of embracing impermanence, releasing attachment, and finding peace in the present moment. This isn't about giving up or forgetting. It's about freeing ourselves from suffering while still honoring what truly matters. But if you've ever struggled with loss, uncertainty, or change, stay with us. This journey may just offer the peace you've been searching for. Understanding pain. Why do we suffer? John had always believed that time would heal his grief. But as the months passed after Margaret's death, the pain remained, lingering like an old song stuck in his head. Mornings were the hardest. He would wake up, instinctively turn toward her side of the bed, only to be met with emptiness. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt unbearable. People told him to stay busy, to focus on the good memories, to keep moving forward. But how do you move forward when your heart is still clinging to the past? One afternoon, as he sat on his porch watching the golden leaves fall from the trees, his old friend Michael stopped by. John barely acknowledged him, his eyes fixed on a single leaf spiraling down to the earth. Michael sat beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Tell me, John, where does your suffering come from?" John let out a heavy sigh. "Isn't it obvious? Margaret is gone. I miss her every second of every day." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "But is it just her absence that causes your pain? Or is it your resistance to that absence?" John frowned. He had never thought about it that way before. Michael continued, "Look at those trees. Do you think they suffer when their leaves fall? Or do they simply accept that this is the way of life?" John watched as another leaf drifted to the ground, its descent slow and graceful. He had spent months fighting against the reality of Margaret's passing, wishing things were different, longing for time to reverse itself. But nothing changed. Nothing could. And yet, the more he resisted, the more the pain grew, as if his very refusal to accept the truth was deepening the wound. Buddhism teaches that suffering, dukkha, is an inevitable part of life, but it also teaches that suffering has a cause, attachment. We suffer not just because things change, but because we want them to stay the same. We hold on to people, experiences, even our own identities, believing they will last forever. But nothing in this world is permanent. The seasons change, the tides rise and fall, and the people we love come and go. The pain John felt wasn't just about losing Margaret. It was about his inability to accept a life without her. Michael looked at him with gentle eyes. "Have you ever been caught in a rip current?" John nodded. "When I was young, I got pulled out to sea once. I panicked and fought against the water, but the harder I struggled, the more exhausted I became. Michael smiled. And how did you survive? John exhaled slowly. I stopped fighting. I let the current carry me until I could swim sideways and escape. Michael placed a hand on John's shoulder. That's exactly how suffering works. The more we resist, the more it pulls us under. But when we stop fighting reality, when we let go of the need to control what we cannot change, peace becomes possible. John sat quietly, absorbing this. He had spent so much time trying to hold on to what was, hoping that if he clung hard enough, he wouldn't have to face what is. But what if letting go didn't mean losing Margaret? What if it simply meant learning to live with her absence in a way that didn't break him? Acceptance doesn't mean we stop loving. It doesn't mean we forget. It means we allow ourselves to move forward without being chained to the past. Love doesn't disappear just because someone is gone. It changes shape. It lingers in the spaces between memories, in the warmth of an old photograph, in the quiet moments of gratitude for what once was. That night, as John lay in bed, he didn't reach for Margaret's side like he usually did. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart, where he still felt her presence. He closed his eyes, and, for the first time in a long while, he didn't fight the silence. He simply let it be. Impermanence. Everything changes. John sat by the window, staring at the garden Margaret had tended to so lovingly. The roses she had planted were beginning to wither, their petals curling inward as autumn deepened. He had promised himself he would keep the garden just as she had left it, watering the plants at the same time each day, trimming the hedges exactly how she liked. But no matter how much he tried, the flowers still faded, the leaves still fell, and the once vibrant colors dulled with time. It was as if life itself was reminding him that nothing stays the same. One morning, as he knelt beside the rose bushes, carefully removing the dried leaves, Michael stopped by. He watched as John meticulously tended to each plant, his movements precise but filled with an unspoken desperation. Trying to hold back time? Michael asked softly. John sighed. I just want to keep this part of her alive. It's the last thing I have left. Michael crouched beside him and ran his fingers over a dried petal. John, do you remember when Margaret planted these? John nodded. She always said the blooms wouldn't last forever, but that was part of what made them beautiful. Michael smiled. She was right. That's the nature of things. Nothing is permanent. Not flowers, not seasons, not even us. The more we resist that truth, the more we suffer. John sat back, staring at the garden. He knew Margaret had understood impermanence. She had never mourned the changing of the seasons, never clung to things beyond their time. Yet here he was, trying to preserve something that was never meant to stay the same. In Buddhism, impermanence, anicca, is one of the fundamental truths of existence. Everything we know, everything we love, is in a constant state of change. The river never flows the same way twice. The body we inhabit today is not the same as it was yesterday. Even our thoughts and emotions shift like the wind. And yet, despite knowing this, we resist. We hold on to moments, relationships, and even our own identities, hoping they will remain unchanged. But when they inevitably do, we feel lost, as if the ground beneath us has crumbled. Michael picked up a leaf that had fallen from a nearby tree. Do you know why people suffer most when they lose someone they love? John looked at him, waiting. It's not just because they're gone, Michael continued. It's because we expect things to last forever. We believe love, happiness, and even life itself should be permanent. But everything we cherish is like this leaf. It exists for a time, serves its purpose, and then it must return to where it came from. John held the leaf in his hands, turning it over, tracing its veins. He thought about Margaret's laughter, the way she would hum softly while cooking, the warmth of her hand in his. He had spent so much time wishing those moments could have lasted forever. But if they had, if nothing ever changed, would they have been as precious? Michael continued. Imagine a song that never ends. At first, it's beautiful. But after a while, without change, without an ending, it loses its meaning. It's the fleeting nature of things that makes them valuable. John thought about that. The reason he had cherished Margaret so much was because their time together had been limited. If they had forever, would he have appreciated every conversation, every touch, every small moment as deeply? Maybe the beauty of life wasn't in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. That night, as John sat in his quiet house, he didn't try to fight the emptiness. Instead, he allowed himself to feel it, not as a loss, but as a reminder of everything he had been given. Margaret's presence was woven into his life in ways that went beyond the physical. She had been, and would always be, a part of him. The next morning, he walked outside, took a deep breath, and for the first time, let a few leaves fall without trying to pick them up. Practicing letting go. How do we really let it be? John had spent his whole life believing that holding on was a sign of love, of strength. He had built his life around Margaret, and when she was gone, he clung to everything that reminded him of her, her garden, her favorite chair, even the way she used to fold the kitchen towels. But no matter how tightly he held on to these things, they couldn't bring her back. Instead, they became weights, anchoring him to a past that no longer existed. One afternoon, as he sat in his living room staring at Margaret's old rocking chair, Michael visited again. He watched John for a while before asking, "Are you ready?" John frowned. "Ready for what?" Michael leaned forward. "To stop carrying what no longer serves you." John sighed. "I don't know how. How do you let go of someone who was your whole world?" Michael smiled gently. "You don't let go of love, John. You let go of suffering." John looked at him, confused. "Aren't they the same thing?" Michael shook his head. "Not at all. Love is what you shared with Margaret, the laughter, the kindness, the years of companionship. Suffering is what happens when you refuse to accept that she's gone." John sat quietly, absorbing these words. For so long, he had believed that moving forward meant betraying Margaret's memory. But what if the real betrayal was refusing to live the life she had loved so much? Michael took a deep breath. Letting go isn't something that happens all at once. It's a practice, and it begins with 3 simple steps. The first step, he explained, was acceptance. Not just acknowledging that Margaret was gone, but truly accepting that life had changed. Fighting reality only deepened his suffering. Margaret wouldn't want him to spend his days trapped in grief. She would want him to find peace. John thought back to their last conversation. Margaret had been sick, but even then, she had smiled at him and said, "Promise me, you'll keep living, John." At the time, he had nodded, not realizing how impossible that promise would feel. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. The second step was releasing attachment, not to Margaret herself, but to the idea that things had to stay the same for him to be happy. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone, placing it in John's hand. "Close your fist around it." John did. "Tighter." John squeezed, his knuckles turning white. "Now hold it as if your life depends on it," Michael instructed. John clenched his fist even harder. "Now let go." John hesitated before, slowly releasing his grip. The stone sat in his palm, harmless, unchanged. Michael smiled. "See? You don't lose the stone by letting go of the tension. You simply stop hurting yourself in the process." John stared at the stone, his heart pounding. It was such a simple exercise, yet it held so much meaning. Holding on to his pain wasn't keeping Margaret close. It was only hurting him. That night, as John walked through the house, he stopped in front of the closet where Margaret's things were still neatly folded. He ran his fingers over one of her scarves, remembering the way she used to wrap it around her neck before stepping out into the cold. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I love you, and I will always love you." Then, with steady hands, he folded the scarf and placed it in a donation box. The third step, Michael had told him, was living in the present. Too often, we live in the past, replaying memories, or in the future, worrying about what's to come. But peace is found only in the now. John had spent months living in the past, in a world that no longer existed. It was time to step back into the present. The next morning, he went for a walk in the park where he and Margaret used to sit and watch the ducks. He sat on their usual bench, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. And for the first time, he didn't feel only her absence. He felt the air, the sounds of the birds, the laughter of children playing nearby. Life was still happening, still unfolding, even in her absence. Buddhism teaches that letting go doesn't mean forgetting or no longer caring. It means loosening our grip on the things we cannot control and allowing life to flow naturally. The more we resist, the more we suffer. But when we open ourselves to what is, rather than clinging to what was, We find peace that a few days later, John found himself humming a familiar tune as he made breakfast. It was Let It Be. The song had always been a favorite of Margaret's, but today it felt like a message just for him. When the night is cloudy, there is still a light that shines on me. Let it be. Maybe that light had been there all along. He had just been too afraid to open his eyes and see it. Live with an open heart, love without strings attached, John had always believed that love meant holding on. For more than 40 years, he and Margaret had built a life together, through the joys and struggles, the quiet moments and the laughter, the simple routines that made up a lifetime. When she passed away, he felt as if his world had collapsed. But what hurt him most wasn't just her absence. It was the fear that, if he let go of the grief, he might somehow lose her completely. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch watching the wind rustle through the trees, Michael joined him again. John had come to expect these visits, moments of quiet companionship and gentle wisdom. Michael didn't try to fix his grief or tell him to move on. Instead, he simply sat beside him, as if to remind him that he wasn't alone. After a long silence, Michael spoke. You know, John, love isn't about possession. John looked at him, puzzled. Isn't that what love is? Holding on to the people we care about. Michael shook his head. Not at all. Love isn't about clinging, it's about giving. Real love allows people to be free. John frowned, unsure of what to say. Michael continued. Imagine holding a bird in your hands. If you grip it too tightly, what happens? John sighed. You suffocate it. Michael nodded. But if you open your hands, it can rest there as long as it chooses. That's what love really is. We don't own the people we care about. We don't get to keep them forever. The tighter we hold on, the more we suffer. But when we learn to love with open hands, we set ourselves free. John looked down at his own hands, remembering the way he used to hold Margaret's. He had held on so tightly to his grief, believing it was the only way to keep her close. But maybe Michael was right. Maybe love didn't have to be something he carried like a weight. Maybe it could be something lighter, something that moved with him rather than keeping him stuck in the past. In Buddhism, the concept of non-attachment doesn't mean we stop loving. It means we love without fear, without grasping, without trying to control what cannot be controlled. It means understanding that everything in life is temporary. Our relationships, our emotions, even our own existence. But instead of fearing that impermanence, we can embrace it, knowing that love isn't measured by how long something lasts, but by how deeply it is felt. John thought about the way he had loved Margaret. He had loved her freely, without conditions, without expecting anything in return. He had loved her in the little things, the way he brought her tea in the mornings, the way he listened to her hum softly as she cooked, the way he laughed at her terrible jokes. That love hadn't disappeared when she did. It was still with him, woven into every part of who he was. That evening, as he sat by the fireplace, he reached for an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, he didn't feel the same ache he once had. Instead of grief, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared, for the time they had been given. He realized that Margaret had never truly belonged to him. She had simply been a gift, a beautiful presence in his life. And he, in turn, had been a presence in hers. Michael's words echoed in his mind. We don't lose love when we let go. We only lose suffering. For the first time in a long while, John felt lighter. He still missed Margaret, and perhaps he always would. But the pain was no longer something he needed to hold on to. He could carry their love forward without being weighed down by sorrow. As he closed the photo album, he whispered softly, "Thank you for the time we had." And for the first time, he truly meant it. The end. Life will always flow. Do you choose to hold on tight or let go? The seasons had changed again. The once golden leaves of autumn had given way to the quiet stillness of winter, and now, with spring just beginning to bloom, the world seemed to awaken with new life. John sat on his porch, a cup of tea warming his hands, watching as the first buds appeared on the trees. He had seen this cycle repeat itself year after year, but this time, something inside him felt different. For months, he had struggled against the natural flow of life, refusing to accept Margaret's absence, gripping tightly to the past, as if his love for her depended on it. But the more he held on, the more he suffered. It was only now, after so many conversations with Michael, after so many quiet moments of reflection, that he understood. Letting go didn't mean losing her. It meant setting himself free. He thought back to a memory from years ago, one of those simple, unremarkable moments that had somehow become precious over time. He and Margaret had been walking along the river near their home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the water. At one point, she stopped and pointed to the river, watching as a fallen leaf drifted effortlessly with the current. "Look at that," she had said, smiling. "The leaf doesn't fight the water. It just lets itself be carried." John hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now, sitting on his porch, he realized how much wisdom there was in that simple observation. Life moves, with or without us. The question is, do we resist it, clinging to what was? Or do we let go, allowing ourselves to be carried forward with grace? For so long, he had feared that releasing his grief would mean forgetting Margaret. But now he understood. Love wasn't something he needed to hold on to. It was something that had already shaped him, something that would always be a part of him. He rose from his chair and walked toward Margaret's garden, the place he had once tried so desperately to preserve exactly as she had left it. He had been afraid that if the flowers faded, if the garden changed, it would mean she was truly gone. But now, as he stood among the new blossoms, he saw things differently. Life wasn't meant to be frozen in time. It was meant to grow, to evolve, to move forward. John knelt down and ran his fingers through the soil, feeling the warmth of the earth. Instead of trying to keep the garden exactly as Margaret had left it, he decided he would care for it in his own way, not as a shrine to the past, but as a living, breathing space. One that could change with the seasons, just as he had. As he stood up, a familiar melody drifted through his mind. Let it be. The words, which had once felt like an impossible task, now felt like a quiet truth. He didn't have to fight the changes. He didn't have to resist the flow of life. He could simply let it be. Taking a deep breath, he whispered, "Thank you, Margaret." Not with sadness, not with longing, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared, for the lessons she had left behind, for the life that was still ahead of him. The river still flowed. The seasons still changed. And for the first time in a long while, John felt ready to move with them.